So now we have all the parts cleaned up and kind of kept separate again, the A parts and the B parts. We're going to go ahead and put this gun back together, talk a little bit about some of the tips on adjusting the valving rod distance, and we'll get that back together then. So we're going to put the O-rings on the piston. Get the O-ring on the valving rod to make sure this big stout spring goes into the piston. I'm going to put a little fusion lube on the threads in the O-ring, and we're going to make the initial adjustment on this piston rod. Is I want to make sure that I've just buried that O-ring into the bore. That way I know it's still far enough back, and when I put it together I won't bang into the tip or damage the end of the rod. So that's a good starting point. Grease on the piston O-rings. This piston is keyed. We have the flats that match up with the flats of the back of the piston bore. Make sure it's clean in there. And we'll just use this to make sure that piston is all the way in. So now we can go ahead and put our rear cap and stop assembly in. We have knurls here, so we don't need pliers on there, but just grab it with a rag, good and tight. So we have to remember to get this O-ring in there. That seals the clean off air. I'll add a little fusion lube when we get to putting the front end on there. So after we've reassembled the rear cap, we're going to get the trigger spool back together. It's the 3 O-rings. Okay, the 3 O-rings are in place. We just put a little fusion lube again. Get that into the, make sure it's all the way out to the front. The spring centered on the spool. Lube on the threads. Snag that down. Okay, so then we'll remember our muffler, cleaned it up. So now that we got the muffler in, we can set the air section aside, and we'll go ahead and put our fluid section together. The A side check. The ball, then the spring, and then the retainer. So we want that retainer screw flat to the back end, or maybe just a thread or half a thread in. We don't want it too far in so that it would restrict the movement of the ball check or the fluid path. The manifold O-ring and the fluid head bore O-ring. Then the screen. So to make sure that the one with the A label goes to the A side of the gun. So sit in like that. And we'll do it again for the B. Standard 80 mesh screen. Other mesh is available if you're running a little coarse material. And that will go into the resin side. Okay, at this point we can put our clean off air, the needle valve assembly back in. Initially I'm just going to have that fall off, just tight, we don't want to over tighten that or strip it out. Okay, so now we have to put the rear retainer and seal. So we're just going to put a little dab of grease in there, kind of hold it in place. What we're going to do is we're going to start this into the back end till it just makes contact. And what we have to do is we have to reverse the fluid head and get that packing tightness right before we put it on, and we won't have access anymore. What we want is a kind of a slip stick feel to it almost. I want to be able to get it on there without really jamming it on, but I like ball like that. I want a bit of a drag on there. So that feels good. So we're going to go ahead and put a little here on and the large Acme threads. That way if we get a crossover, it'll be easier to take this thing apart. So we go ahead and get that one started on the rear seal. Orientate the gun where the clean off air is to the top. Use a rag to kind of make sure that retaining ring is tight. We don't want to put pliers on there. Okay, so now we can take our mix module. If we haven't done so already, we want to just make sure that we clean all the ports with the right size drill bit. This happens to be a 35, so it has 2 impingement ports for the resin and 2 impingement ports for the ISO. So just kind of gently drill those. Some will have just 1 port, some will have 4, depending on the size of your mix module. Just put a little grease in there. Okay, so then we want to just set our front packing there, and we're going to actually tighten this retainer. A little snug. We're going to put our tip on and our tip retainer. Okay, so this is where we have to put air back to the gun so that when it's off, but it'll be all the way forward, then we can adjust that piston throw where we're just going to bring the rod to make contact with that tip, and then we're just going to back it off about a wrench flatter, about 1/5 of this hex top. So go ahead and with the safety on, bring the air on, so it brought that rod forward. We're just going to screw that in until it just makes contact, then just back it off about making about 1 flat of your spin tight. Make sure everything triggers. So that valving rod's adjusted, so it comes up behind the tip, so things won't get built up back there, but it won't actually be slamming into the back of that tip, damaging the tip of that valving rod. Go ahead and put the air cap on. So when we actually go to spray, we're going to open up this air, clean off air. Make sure that port is open. You kind of hear that air. That's the air blowing across the cap to keep it clean. About a 1/2 turn or so. Okay, if this is going to be stored for a while, I recommend putting some grease into the ports. We want to put the night cap on. It's just the flush block that we send with the gun, and that can be ready to go in your stores, or we can put it back on the hose and be ready to spray.